June 6, 1944. Omaha Beach, easy red sector. 6:29 hours. The Atlantic is a churning graveyard of gray mist and diesel exhaust. High atop the bluffs of Widerstandsnest 62, a German Obergefreiter presses his eyes against his Zeiss binoculars, scanning the chaotic horizon. He expects to see the flat-nosed prows of landing craft, vulnerable boxes of plywood and steel that must hit the sand before they can vomit their cargo. Instead, he sees something that defies the laws of military physics. 3,000 yards out, bobbing precariously in the 6-foot swells, are low-profile shapes. They look like canvas skiffs, small and fragile, seemingly held together by hope alone. The German gunners wait for these boats to flounder in the surf, but the shapes keep coming. They don't beach. They don't stop. As the water shallows to 5 feet, the canvas screens suddenly collapse like a falling curtain. From the salt spray emerges the unmistakable, terrifying silhouette of an M4 Sherman. 30 tons of American steel, rising from the depths of the ocean like a leviathan, its 75mm gun already traversing toward the pillboxes. The sentry screams into his radio, but the report sounds like madness. The Americans are not landing tanks. The tanks are swimming. The mechanical impossible has become reality, and the German defensive crust is about to be shattered by a weapon that refuses to wait for a bridge. By the winter of 1943, the German High Command, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, clung to a singular, comforting strategic reality. The geography of Europe was on their side. To the planners in Berlin, the liberation of the continent was not just a matter of defeating the Allied soldier. It was a matter of defeating the European river system. From the winding Seine and the rapid Meuse to the titanic, ancient barrier of the Rhine, Europe was a series of natural moats. Adolf Hitler's Fortress Europe was not merely a line of concrete bunkers along the coast. It was a layered defense in depth where every bridge destroyed by a retreating German unit turned a kilometer of water into a month-long delay for the Allies. The German doctrine of Verteidigung, defense, relied heavily on the bridgehead principle. They understood that an army is at its most vulnerable when it is straddling a body of water. Without a bridge, a tank is a useless hunk of iron. Without a bridge, heavy artillery remains silent on the wrong side of the bank. Without a bridge, an invasion grinds to a halt. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Erwin Rommel banked on this. They spent years cataloging every crossing point, every fordable stream, and every massive stone bridge from the Netherlands to the Swiss border. The German strategy was simple: fight at the water's edge, and if forced to retreat, blow the bridges. They calculated the weight of the Allied Shermans and the British Churchills, knowing these machines required heavy-duty steel infrastructure to move. By their math, the Allies would be forced into predictable choke points, narrow corridors where German 88mm guns could sit and wait, zeroed in on the only possible places a tank could cross. They looked at the Rhine, a river over 400 meters wide in places with currents that could sweep away a small ship, and saw an impassable wall. The German engineers laughed at the idea of an army moving 40-ton vehicles across such a torrent without months of preparation. In their mind, the river was not just a feature of the landscape. It was a weapon. They believed they could dictate the pace of the war by simply removing the floor from beneath the Allied boots. What they failed to account for was the American and British obsession with mobile engineering, a philosophy that viewed a river not as a wall, but as a problem to be bypassed through sheer industrial audacity. While the German High Command viewed the rivers of Europe as static walls, the Allied Supreme Command, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, viewed them as a logistical nightmare that could lead to a second Dunkirk. The memories of the Dieppe raid in 1942 haunted the planners. There, tanks had been trapped on the shingle, unable to overcome simple sea walls and obstacles, leading to a slaughter. If the liberation of Europe was to succeed, the Allies knew they couldn't just land tanks. They had to keep them moving at the speed of a motorized blitz. The problem was one of weight and physics. The primary Allied medium tank, the M4 Sherman, weighed roughly 30 to 33 tons. The heavier British Churchill could exceed 40 tons. Most existing civilian bridges in rural France and Belgium were designed for horse-drawn wagons or light automobiles. They would buckle under the weight of a single armored platoon. Furthermore, the Germans had become masters of scorched earth bridge demolition. By the time an Allied scout reached a riverbank, the stone arches were usually nothing but jagged ruins in the water. In the high-level briefings at Southwick House, the pressure was immense. If the infantry crossed in small boats, but the tanks were stuck on the far bank, the German panzer divisions would counterattack and drive the foot soldiers back into the sea. The Allies needed a way to bring the bridge with them, or better yet, make the tanks independent of bridges entirely. This desperation birthed a secret partnership between British eccentric genius and American industrial might. Major General Percy Hobart, a man once forced into the Home Guard for his radical ideas on armored warfare, was brought back to lead the 79th Armored Division. His task was to create Hobart's Funnies, a collection of specialized vehicles designed to overcome any geographic barrier. Simultaneously, across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers was working on the M2 steel treadway. These weren't just bridges. They were giant, modular Legos made of high-strength steel that could be snapped together under fire. The goal was to reduce the time it took to cross a river from days to mere hours. The Allies were preparing for a war of flow, while the Germans were prepared for a war of friction. This clash of philosophies would reach its boiling point on the banks of every canal from the Orne to the Elbe, where the sight of a Sherman simply driving across a river would leave German defenders questioning if they were fighting men or sorcerers. To understand how the Sherman defied the geography of Europe, one must look at the two distinct angles of Allied engineering: the tank that could swim and the bridge that could fly into place. The first angle is the technological marvel of the duplex drive, known as the DD tank. This was a standard M4 Sherman modified with a folding waterproof canvas screen and a twin propeller system. Developed by the Hungarian-born inventor Nicholas Strasser, the DD was a masterpiece of hidden engineering. When the screen was raised, the tank looked like a harmless, bloated boat, providing enough displacement to keep 30 tons of steel afloat. The duplex drive referred to the power transfer. The engine could switch from driving the tracks on land to driving the propellers in the water. For the German defenders, this was a technological black swan. They had spent years perfecting anti-tank obstacles at the water's edge, assuming no tank could reach the sand until a harbor was captured. The DD Sherman rendered thousands of miles of coastal and river defense obsolete in a single morning. The second angle is the tactical speed of the treadway. While the DD tanks were the first responders, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers provided the permanent solution with the M2 steel treadway bridge. This was a tactical revolution in modular construction. Unlike the heavy, slow-to-assemble stone or timber bridges of the past, the treadway used pneumatic pontoons and prefabricated steel tracks. Tactically, this changed everything. An American engineering company could arrive at a blown bridge at midnight, and by dawn, a 100-foot steel span would be ready to support a column of Shermans. The Germans often watched from the opposite heights in stunned silence as the Allies manufactured river crossings in the duration of a single watch shift. It wasn't just that the Shermans could cross. It was that they could cross anywhere, at any time, making it impossible for the Wehrmacht to concentrate their dwindling reserves. The third angle is the human element, the terror of the canvas bathtub. While the engineers hailed the DD Sherman as a triumph, for the 5-man crew inside, it was a claustrophobic nightmare. To make a Sherman float, the canvas screen had to be raised, effectively placing the crew inside a well below the waterline. If the screen ripped or a large wave crested over the top, the tank would sink like a stone in seconds. The drivers and commanders operated with their hatches open, standing on their seats, knowing that if the tank foundered, only those at the top had a chance of escaping. On D-Day, at Omaha Beach, 27 out of 29 DD tanks from the 741st Tank Battalion foundered in the heavy seas, sending dozens of men to the bottom of the channel. For the survivors, the psychological toll was immense. They were driving a heavy armored vehicle that felt as fragile as a rowboat, knowing that their lives depended on a few yards of waterproof fabric. The final angle is the enemy's perspective, the illusion of safety. To the German soldier, a river was a place of rest. Behind the banks of the Seine or the Rhine, a Lancer, infantryman, felt he could finally smoke a cigarette without fear of a surprise armor breakthrough. When the first reports of swimming tanks filtered back to German high command, they were often dismissed as battle fatigue or hallucinations. German tactical manuals were built on the fixed-point theory. Tanks come from roads and bridges. When Shermans began appearing in the middle of flooded marshes or crossing rivers where the bridges had been blown hours prior, it shattered German morale. It created a ghost effect. The Wehrmacht felt they were fighting an enemy that could walk on water. This shock led to a breakdown in the German defensive psyche. They began to realize that no matter how many bridges they blew, the Amos would simply reappear behind their lines, their engines roaring and their 75mm guns loaded, having bypassed the impenetrable barrier in the dead of night. March 23, 1945. Oppenheim, Germany. 2200 hours. The air is thick with the sulfurous stench of thousands of smoke generators, creating an artificial fog that blankets the water. This is Operation Plunder, the final, massive push into the German heartland. The Rhine is the last great obstacle, a deep, fast-flowing torrent that has served as Germany's psychological and physical shield for centuries. On the eastern bank, the remnants of the Wehrmacht have dug in with desperate ferocity, convinced that if they can hold the river, they can force a stalemate. At Oppenheim, the U.S. 5th Infantry Division and the 4th Armored Division prepare for a feat of engineering that would have been deemed impossible just months prior. Under the cover of darkness, the Seabees and Army engineers launch their secret weapon. It isn't just the DD Shermans this time. It is the sheer, overwhelming velocity of bridge building. As the first waves of infantry paddle across in storm boats, the engineers begin their work. They are not building one bridge. They are building a highway. Amidst the whistle of German mortar fire and the rhythmic thump of 88mm shells hitting the water, the Americans begin deploying the M2 treadway. Huge duck, DUKW, amphibious trucks, and heavy cranes groan as they swing 2,000-pound steel sections into place. The Germans, staring through the haze, are waiting for the Allied momentum to stall at the water's edge. They expect a build-up phase that lasts days. Instead, they witness a mechanical frenzy. By 6 o'clock the following morning, while the German commanders are still drafting reports about the initial infantry crossings, the first heavy treadway spans the Rhine. Then comes the sound that signals the end of the Third Reich, the rhythmic metallic clack-clack-clack of Sherman tracks hitting steel plating. In less than 12 hours, a river that should have held back an army for weeks has been conquered. The shock is not just tactical, it is systemic. The German defenders realize that the Rhine hasn't just been crossed, it has been erased. As the sun rises over the Rhine on March 24th, the German defenders at Wesel and Oppenheim witness a logistical miracle that borders on the supernatural. Throughout the night, despite the frantic shelling from German batteries, the Allied engineers refused to take cover. They worked in the freezing water, bolting steel to steel. The German 1st Parachute Army, tasked with holding the line, finds itself paralyzed. Their tactical manuals state that an armored breakthrough requires a captured stone bridge or days of pontoon construction. They have zeroed their artillery on the ruins of the old bridges, waiting for the Americans to try and repair them. But the Americans aren't there. They are 3 miles downstream, where no bridge has ever existed, and they're pouring across the water at a rate of 1 tank every minute. The shock peaks when German counterattack units, including the heavy Jag Panthers, attempt to rush the emerging bridgeheads. They expect to find lightly armed infantry huddling in foxholes. Instead, they are met by full companies of Shermans that have only been on the eastern bank for 20 minutes. These tanks, still dripping with Rhine water and some still sporting the shredded remnants of their DD canvas screens, open fire with devastating coordination. The speed of the crossing has outpaced the German ODA loop, observe, orient, decide act. By the time a German regimental commander identifies a crossing point and orders a strike, 3 more bridges have been completed nearby. The water wall has not just been breached, it has been bypassed in a dozen places simultaneously. General Patton's Third Army reported that they crossed the Rhine without even a preliminary artillery bombardment at Oppenheim, simply because the Germans were so convinced that a crossing there, without a bridge, was impossible. The silence of the German guns in those first few hours was the silence of a military mind that had been completely out-engineered. The successful crossing of the Rhine was the psychological death knell for the German defense in the West. By effectively erasing the river as a strategic barrier, the Allies had achieved what the Germans feared most, a war of maneuver on German soil. The aftermath was characterized by a total breakdown of the Wehrmacht's ability to form a cohesive front. Because the Shermans could cross without the need for fixed infrastructure, the German High Command lost the ability to predict Allied movements. In the days following the breakthrough, the Ruhr Pocket began to form. This was the industrial heart of Germany, and it was quickly encircled by the U.S. First and Ninth Armies. The Germans had banked on the rivers and canals of the Ruhr to act as defensive moats, but the Allied engineers were now operating at a terrifying tempo. In one instance, a 1,100-foot bridge was constructed across the Rhine in just 9 hours. The mobility afforded by the DD Shermans and the treadway units meant that the Allies could bypass strongpoint cities. If a German garrison held a vital bridge in a town, the Allied column simply moved 2 miles upriver, built their own crossing in the dark, and surrounded the town from the rear. This led to the surrender of over 300,000 German soldiers in the Ruhr alone. The German soldier, once the master of the Blitzkrieg, found himself outpaced by a logistical machine that didn't just move over the landscape, but reshaped it to suit its needs. The impenetrable Rhine had been turned into a highway, and the heart of the German war machine was now beating its last. The statistical reality of the Allied bridge-killing campaign provides a staggering look at the scale of the German miscalculation. By the end of the Rhine campaign, Allied engineers had constructed over 60 tactical bridges across the river. The Germans, who had spent decades studying the Rhine as a defensive barrier, were psychologically broken by the sheer industrial output. They had expected to fight a series of slow, grinding sieges at every major crossing. Instead, they faced a flood of armor that seemed to ignore the river entirely. The M2 Treadway and the Bailey Bridge became the unsung heroes of the final months. In the month of March 1945 alone, U.S. engineers laid down miles of steel across water. The German logistics, relying on horse-drawn carts and a dwindling rail network, simply could not compete with an army that could bridge a 400-meter gap in a single night. Verifiable reports from the OKW during this period show a frantic, almost panicked tone. Commanders were being court-martialed for failing to protect riverbanks that were physically impossible to guard against swimming tanks and modular bridges. The human cost for the Germans was total. With their mobility stripped away by the Allies' ability to bypass blown bridges, entire divisions were trapped in pockets. The shock mentioned in German journals wasn't just about the Shermans. It was about the realization that German engineering, once the envy of the world, had been eclipsed by American mass production. A captured German officer of the 7th Parachute Division reportedly remarked that he knew the war was over not when he saw the first American tank, but when he saw the first American bridge built in the time it took him to eat breakfast. The Rhine was no longer a moat. It was a grave for the German strategy of static defense. The sight of a 30-ton steel beast emerging from the surf or crossing a torrential river without a stone arch beneath it remains one of the most potent symbols of the Second World War. For the German soldier, it was a moment of profound technological shock, a realization that the very earth and water they relied upon for protection had been conquered by Allied ingenuity. But this story is about more than just canvas screens and steel planks. It is a reflection on the nature of modern warfare. The M4 Sherman, often criticized for its thin armor or underpowered gun compared to the German Tigers and Panthers, proved that mobility is its own form of protection. The Allies did not win the war by having the heaviest tanks but by having the tanks that could be anywhere at any time. In the grand theater of history, we often focus on the generals and the frontline riflemen. Yet, the victory in Europe was equally won by the grease-stained engineers and the canvas bathtub crews who turned the geography of a continent into a tactical advantage. They proved that no wall is high enough and no river is wide enough to stop an enemy that refuses to accept the limitations of the map. The legacy of the bridge killers lives on in modern military doctrine, where the ability to maintain flow is still the difference between victory and stalemate. It serves as a reminder that in the face of an immovable object, the human spirit, backed by industrial might, will always find a way to move through the impossible. The Rhine still flows, and the beaches of Normandy remain, but the memory of the day the water failed to protect the fortress remains etched in the annals of military legend.